Hey folks, welcome to Hobbyshire. My name is Chris and today we are going to be making this, a summoning portal within an ancient ruined temple. To quickly explain why I chose to make this, first let me state that when I play Warhammer, I never play at competitions or public events, etc. I only play RPG hobbies at home with family and close friends, so we don't need to follow strict rule guidelines. In fact, when I play Warhammer with my little gang, we use custom rules that I've made up. One of those custom rules is that when your units die, you can potentially buy them back and revive them, with limitations and a few other details, but that's the basic gist of it. I wanted to make something for the battlefield where players in my Warhammer campaigns have to physically take their commander to in order to resurrect their fallen allies, and so for that I chose to make a summoning portal. I also wanted to be able to use this in other RPGs if it ever came up, such as Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that, so I kept that in mind during its creation. Alrighty, let's make a cup of tea and then get started. So first things first, like I always do with new projects, I made a few very rough sketches. Something to remember here is that my sketches are rarely gospel. They will allow me to gather a general idea, but I'm often constantly changing the project as I'm creating it. So this is unlikely to be 100% accurate in regards to the finished piece. I knew I wanted the shape to be rectangular, and I roughly wanted the size to be 9 by 12 inches. But I also knew I wanted to add a single step all around the edge, so it would be more like 11 by 14 inches. I also originally planned to have it 1 inch thick, but upon preparing the foam I didn't like that, so I kept the thickness at 10mm instead. I wanted to add a statue here and possibly another step. I would definitely keep the statue, but I wasn't sure at this point about that step. I wanted pillars around the edges, but since this is an ancient abandoned temple, the pillars would be battered, beaten and broken. I also wanted some walls around the edges, as this was once a fully erect building, but it's now since ruined and these walls are remnants of what they once were, so it'll just be little bits of walls, not fully heighted walls. I know what I'm saying. It's going to have rubble everywhere as well as moss. Oh, and that purple starfish thingy in the middle is going to be the summoning portal itself, which is represented by a crack in the ground, but more on that part later. To actually build this beast, there are a few things we are going to need to get started. I'll put a list off to the side of the screen showing where I got them from or some suggestions of places that supply them, but you get this stuff from whatever places are available in your particular region. The list is just there to be helpful for those who don't know where to look. We will need some XPS foam. We will be texturing this foam, so EPS won't really work as good, but if that's all you can get, you could give it a try I suppose. I just don't personally recommend it. We will need a ruler or measuring device. We will need a pencil or drawing device. We will need a utility knife and or a craft knife. We will need a ballpoint pen, or some kind of pen that has a similar spout and tip to a ballpoint. Is that what we call it? A spout? Sounds funny. Imagine being at school and being like, "Sir, something is stuck in the spout of my pen. The ink is not spouting anymore." Anywho, moving on. We also need some tin foil, or kitchen foil, or aluminium foil as it's called, unless you're from one of those countries that call it aluminum foil. I can't even say it that way, but it's all the same thing, and you'll need some, so get some. We need some rocks, and we need some quick bonding wood glue. You can use PVA or something instead of this. I just like wood glue because it grips on quicker when you stick things together. Once I had my foam cut to size, which by the way I did with a utility knife because it was too big to do easily on the Proxon, I marked out a grid with a pencil and ruler. I haven't shown this because it's pretty straightforward. Just draw lines every 1 inch vertically and then do the same horizontally, and this leaves you with relatively perfect 1 inch by 1 inch squares. The large piece will mostly be covered up. I could have just marked the edges with a grid instead of the whole thing, but I still wasn't sure yet whether I was going to cut holes. So I decided to grid the whole thing just to be prepared in case I changed my mind on anything in the future. After that, I took the craft knife and scored along the grid lines. Not all the way through, I'm not trying to cut anything off. I went maybe 3 or 4 millimeters deep, or at the most halfway. If you are going for a well-kept, high-quality temple or anything like that, I would suggest using a ruler when you score to keep that line straight. But because this build is ancient, ruined and forsaken, I didn't mind if it went a tad wobbly, because that just added to the effect of a worn tile floor edge. Once I scored all the lines that I knew would be visible, I went over them with a ballpoint pen. I clicked the pen on so that I could push just the tip in, and I'm going deep enough so that the spout of the pen is grinding along the score line. I'm doing this because it really opens up the score marks and adds a good look of realism to how I imagine a tiled floor in ancient times would look. If I didn't do this and I just left it with a knife scores, most of that would be lost once the paint and layering comes, but this way those tile dividing lines will remain apparent. Going one step further with a worn and torn kinda look, I selected random tiles and cut away chunks with a craft knife. This represents where the rock slabs would have taken a beating through various means, such as natural elements, age, lack of maintenance, any number of reasons. I just wanted it to look in really poor condition. Doing this also adds a bit of texture, depth and a 3D look to it. I also wanted to add some cracks in the tiles. I did this by drawing random squiggly squid lines with a pen and then scoring and emphasizing them in the same way I did the grid lines. I made my decision about where I wanted the summoning portal. It's not a fancy pool or anything like that, it's a rupture in the ground, but I'll get to that later. As to how I did it, I cut a rough shape with a knife to get a hole there, then I shaped the edges more specifically once I had the room to work. Next it was time to add textures across the whole thing. I'm sure you've seen this trick in other videos and stuff, because at the end of the day it is the easiest and simplest way to do it. All you do is take your Alamumu minion foil and scrunch it up into a ball and away you go. I don't roll it across the board because I find that can quickly smooth out the crinkles on the outside of the tinfoil ball, and it's those crinkles we want to make the texture. Instead I pick a spot and I rock the foil in random patterns back and forth. The result is quick, easy and really effective. Like all things though, I like to layer the things I do, and texturing is no different. When I'm done with the tinfoil, I switch to some rough rocks that I found at the riverside. I mix up how hard I'm pushing, so that sometimes it leaves a subtle texture, other times it's more obvious. When it comes to those squiggly squig cracks that I did earlier, I pressed really hard on some of those to push them in and make the rock look like it's a bit tilted and crumbled away at the break. At this stage all that's left to do is to glue it together. I used the wood glue like I mentioned before because it is quick bonding, and that means that it will grip to each other a lot quicker and I'll be able to work on it without having to wait for it to fully dry. Once I've put all the glue on and I've lined up the top piece, I then turn it upside down and I weight it down with heavy objects. The reason I've put it upside down is because I don't want any of the heavy objects to leave dents in the texture that we've just made on the surface, because that would destroy it. So, whilst we have a bit of time spare, I want to take a moment to talk about the lore of this structure. I like to build histories and stories in my mind that surround the things I make, and I thought I would share this one with you so that you could better understand why this summoning portal is the way it is. I'll share some drawings which hopefully will help visualize the description I'm giving you, and I ask you to please not be jealous of my drawing skills. I know you're going to tell me I should become a professional artist, but honestly I don't want to make Van Gogh, Da Vinci and Picasso jealous with my awesome skills, okay? Okay, so here goes. A long time ago there was a demon god. He was huge and powerful and impressive. He became curious about the mortal realm, so he took a stroll around it to explore. He came upon a tribe of people who were amazed by this mighty being. So much so that they decided to build him a temple where they could worship him. The demon god was impressed with the tribe building him a temple and flattered by their worship. So he imbued the temple with healing magic and gave them gifts of various types. This just made the villagers worship him all the more. But the demon god had a big brother, one who was also a demon god, a much more powerful one. And when he saw how this tribe worshipped his little brother, he became enraged with jealousy. He brought his demon army to come and kill the tribe. The tribe tried to fight back and a mighty war ensued, demon god versus demon god. But ultimately, the Big Brother's armies of demons achieved victory, slaughtering every man, woman, child and even dog in that tribe. The Big Brother also killed his little brother and commanded his army to burn the village and everything in it to the ground, including the temple. As time passed by, months, years, centuries, the lands became known as cursed lands. The magic once held within the temple was soiled by all that death and became corrupted, eventually rupturing out of the ground in a festering pool of dark magic. Now, others who come across the temple and find that magic seeping within the forsaken walls try to use it for their own gain, such as raising the dead. So now that you know the story behind this, and with the base ready to go, I wanted to work on the pillars next. I was torn between rounded pillars, like you typically see in Roman and Greek structures, or something more original. I decided to make some blocky rectangular pillars mainly because I wanted an excuse to play around on the Proxon. You can make whatever kind of pillars you like, create your own style and go from there, but just in case you want to make them similar to how I made mine, this is what you'll need. XPS foam. It's the same as the pink stuff I used, just a different colour. People tend to think colour matters, and while some brands are a little different than others in terms of density, all XPS foam is suitable for what we need it for in modelling and dioramas. I cut mine on the Proxon, and you can see how I did that in my Proxon review video on my channel. If you don't have a Proxon, just use a utility knife. I'm not going to go into detail such as sizes of the pieces etc. simply because I never measured any of these bits. I just roughed it out and went by eye until I had something that I liked. The total height of these pillars is around 5.5 inches, with 1/3 of that being the base and 2/3 of that being the shaft, or whatever you want to call it. But I do highly recommend here just letting your creativity flow free. Cut a bunch of shapes and stack them until you make some original funky pillar. If you're like me, you'll really enjoy the process of that guesswork, and you'll find an element of achievement when you've made something that you like. For scale purposes though, try not to go higher than 6 inches in this particular project or it might look odd. You will also need some coffee stirrers, but if you want to go wider than coffee stirrers, use lollipop sticks. You can snap the stirrers to size if you wish, or use a knife or a saw. For me, I use some clippies, or pliers as you might call them. You'll also want a wire brush. I like to have a really rough, bristled one. And of course you'll need some glue of choice. PVA is absolutely fine if you can handle the pieces slipping around whilst you fiddle with them, but hot glue with a glue gun is probably best if you're worried about that issue. It's what I probably would have gone with, but in this instance I used wood glue for the sole reason that the bottle was nearly empty and I wanted to use it up so I could throw the bottle away. Starting with the base, I roughed up the surface with a wire brush. This is to give a better area for the glue to grip onto. The Proxon leaves a very smooth surface after a cut, and if we were to leave it like that, the glue could dry without being a particularly strong bond. Like how you can often peel glue straight off a smooth surface after it's dried. This way leaves them little scratches and marks caused by the wire brush and allows the glue to sink into them areas and grab hold of it tightly to make a stronger and better bond in the long run. Then it was just a case of doing this process with every piece, one by one, gluing the pillars together one step at a time. Like I mentioned a moment ago, this would be easier with a hot glue gun because it was a little annoying how it kept moving around due to the glue still being wet, but I managed good enough in the end. I did make a couple of extra pillars, more than I needed, just as a backup in case one broke further down the line. It would mean that I had a replacement ready and waiting. I also wasn't entirely sure how many pillars exactly I wanted on the build yet, and I knew I wouldn't be able to make that decision until I had them all fully constructed and I could move them around on the base until I had them placed how I liked it. Once all the pillars were stuck together, I used the coffee stirrers to make little beams going up the edges. If you was making new, better quality, well-maintained pillars, I would recommend measuring these more accurately and cutting them more carefully. The clippies worked for me because I wanted it to look tatty. And so once I had snipped them, I then lined them up like you can see in the video. And I'm going to do this on every edge all the way around. Originally I wanted this to just be an extra layer of brick, but in the end, as you'll see in the future, I turned this into metal. Although I loved the pillars and how they turned out, they did look far too crisp and sharp-edged and new for my liking, because as I've said many times throughout this video, I want it tattered and torn because this is an ancient temple. So I whipped out the Proxxon and I just started to cut off snippets here and there to make it look like the rock had crumbled away. I cut all the way through on some of the pillars to make it look like those pillars had toppled over completely. When I was satisfied with the cuts, I textured the pillars the exact same way that I textured the base earlier with the Alamumu foil and the rocks from the riverside. Then I glued them to the base and I used some of those chunks that I had cut off with a Proxxon to act as rubble here and there. I've been trying to keep it brief so that this video doesn't turn out too annoyingly long for you all, but at this point in the project I just want to give you a few things to keep in mind when placing your pillars and how you decide to place them. If you are making something like this solely for the purpose of a decorative diorama or anything like that, you don't need to worry about it, but if like me you are using this for Warhammer or D&D or any tabletop RPG, remember that you need to give this enough room for your miniature figures to get in there. Not just that, but these miniature figures often have wide, round or square bases, so it's very important to keep that in mind when you are placing everything. If you make it too cluttered, it might look nice, but it won't be usable because there'll be nowhere to put your miniatures without them falling over. For my purpose personally, I know that due to this being the only place on the battlefield where players will be able to revive fallen allies, it's going to be a hotspot and get contested pretty often with plenty of fighting and battles likely taking place here. So I opted to only go for 6 pillars, whereas I was originally thinking of 8, but 6 just seemed better. This would ensure that there would not only be enough room for miniatures to move around in there, but that there would also be areas on the build where a smart commander could make choke points and set up ambushes with plenty of cover and stuff like that. In a dark and dusty corner of my home, I have a box of forgotten minis and lost old scraps of models that I no longer partake in. I think there is even the carcass of a family cat in there that went missing a few months back. I'm kidding, don't call officials on me. Anyway, in this box I found a little miniature. The hammer had broken off, but I glued it back on. And I also found 2 loose wings. I'm pretty sure they were both left side wings, but I made it work and glued them to the back of the model anyway. I'm not very knowledgeable with old Warhammer figures, so I have no clue who this is or where this model came from. It was probably out of an old box set that I bought ages ago and never finished, threw aside and forgot about. I obviously don't want him as a playable mini, otherwise he wouldn't be in this box, so I'm going to use him as a statue instead. I don't want him on ground level though, so I snapped one of the bases off one of the leftover pillars, and I wanted him to stand even higher than that, so I took some of the leftover pillar slabs and stacked them on top of that base. I deliberately angled them a little askew and crooked to give a better tattered look. I glued them in place and then I stuck cocktail sticks through them so that they didn't move anymore. I also wasn't done with the pillars themselves. I used a cocktail stick to stab each corner of the base with every pillar. Just to puncture a hole there, they didn't stay there. As soon as I punctured the hole, I took the cocktail stick straight back out. But then I cut the ends of the cocktail sticks and stuck the spikes in the holes, gluing them in place so they look like little, well, spikes. They will eventually be metal and hopefully look very cool, adding a gothic grungy touch of style to the whole overall model. For the next step, we are going to need these little rocks. I didn't buy these from anywhere, I looted them from the wilderness, and I suggest doing the same. If you truly can't, then fine, buy them, but to me there's absolutely no point in spending your precious money on something that you can get for free. For me, I took the opportunity to walk my dogs along the river that my city is situated near. It's a nice big river with rocky beaches all along its edge, so it's the perfect place to gather rocks like these. They don't need to be a specific type of rock, I just wanted them to be small and not completely smooth like some rounded pebbles you might find. Just take a stroll along the river or beach or woodlands or even your backyard and I'm sure you'll find plenty. Just make sure to throw them in a tub with boiling hot water for a while, or you might find you bring home some creatures like a beetle hiding in a hole in the rock, or even worse, a spider. You also need a big tub like this. Mine is an empty coffee tub that I got from Asda. I drank the coffee first, don't worry. And if you watched my last video, which was the Proxxon review, you would have seen me making these little things. they are going to be bricks. They are 2 centimeters long and then 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter in height and thickness. They do look nice as they are. You can clearly tell individually that they are bricks. But if I were to put these together just like this, in this state and condition, they would lose their edges and just look like one smooth, large, weird shape. So I need to round those edges a bit, texture them, and make them look a little bit less smoothy Judy and a bit more bricky Martin. To do this, we are going to put them in the coffee tub along with the rocks and then shake it all about like a maraca. Make sure to give it a good shake. This is a very easy method, but it doesn't take effect instantly. You have to do this for a few minutes at least, and don't be afraid to put some force behind it. I'm going to be honest, I did shake it for a bit myself, but then I put it on the floor and rolled it towards my dog. He's a very playful pooch and he immediately pounced on it and proceeded to try and tackle it, which resulted in the tub getting rolled around and knocked about for a bit. I could record this next time if it is something you want to see, so let me know, but it did the job the same, and once ready, take off the lid, pour them out, and you will see that they now look like this. It's just such a good effect. They really do look exactly like worn stone now. I was so happy with this at this point, I immediately moved on to the next step very eagerly. If you haven't already guessed it, the next step are the walls. Now originally, in its prime state, I'm sure these walls were glorious to behold and stood tall and proud. Now, however, they are remnants of what they used to be, little more than the crumbled down skeletons of the past. With that in mind, I won't be making these bricks too high, and in most places it will all be falling apart, even with a brick scattered loosely by itself here and there around the edges. If you are going for a well-kept temple or want a bit more sharpness to your look, I would suggest using a ruler or a right angle to make sure you get the walls perfectly straight. For me, I wanted them crooked and didn't mind if they were slanted or looked a little off. Besides, who am I trying to impress? No one. This is for my enjoyment, so my opinion is the only one that matters, and I was just having fun with it. I just did it by eye, without any ruler, and it worked perfectly. I'm using tacky glue, which I have squirted onto a disposable paint palette sheet, and then I'm just dipping the bricks in and then placing them on the board. I'm going around working from pillar to pillar, making it high in some places, low in others, with gaps here and there. I'm also deliberately placing some bricks a little further back than the one next to it, or a little further forward, just to add some depth in a very nice and realistic style. If there are any gaps where a brick won't fit, just slice it to size using your craft knife or utility knife. And to note, I obviously left a gap at the front and did not build any wall between the 2 front pillars to symbolise an entrance. I was loving this and how it was starting to take shape, and my mind was on fire with imaginations of placing this building on a hill in the middle of a map and trying to hold it against an onslaught of enemies in a fierce last stand sort of battle. It still had a long way to go until it was finished, but I couldn't wait to use it in a campaign. Optional addition here, I did consider adding the cocktail spikes in place on top of some of these bricks like I did on the pillars, but decided not to in the end. However, if you wanted to do that, I'm sure it would definitely add an atmosphere of violence to the project, especially if you chose to make them bloodstained further down the line. To finish off any of the brickwork for the time being, I give a little love and attention to the podium that the statue was going to go on. If you remember, I put those slabs on top, but all the edges was nice and smooth and even, so I cut some lines vertically along that to make it appear like bricks stacked, and then I textured it with some tinfoil and left it at that. It looks really nice, I think. For the next step, I'm going to use some tea. All I did was keep all my used tea bags, let them dry out, then cut them open and poured the actual tea onto a baking tray. I baked it on a super low setting for about 30 minutes. Not only did the house smell lovely, if you like the smell of tea leaves, but it also dried it out nicely. It's a really good natural base cover and can look like compost, dirt or scattered wood bark sometimes. I mixed this with some cork dust and some chunky sand. All of it goes into a plastic cup, which also has plenty of PVA glue. I mixed it all together into a paste, and then I just started to dollop this on in various places, especially in some of those cracks that I cut out of the base earlier with a knife. I'm doing this for a couple of reasons. One, it adds an additional texture to the project, and the more different textures you have on a project, the better in my opinion. And 2, because this temple was so worn out and old that it's going to be overgrown with moss. I won't be adding the moss until near the end of the task, but this mix will mark out where most of that is going, and it'll also add a nice little underlayer beneath the moss when it's put in place. After I have pasted it where I want it, I also sprinkle some on top of the mix with my fingers to further add depth and appeal to it. I used that same mix to stick the statue to the podium. The reason I did this instead of using neat glue is because all the bits in the glue would then add texture to the base of the statue, such as debris and rubble and grime that might have built up there. Whilst waiting for this to all now completely dry, I went back to my dusty box of scraps in the dark corner and I grabbed a tub of extras and spares. I also grabbed this box of skulls from Citadel. I think for how many skulls you get in the box, it's a bargain, or at least it was for me because I got it for £10, and there are just so many skulls inside. I have no use for them right now, I just bought them because they was on sale. I think outside of the sale they are about £16–17, which is still a bargain in my opinion for what you get, but since I've had no use for them, I'm going to add them to this project. Now, I cannot tell you how to paint your spares because the chances are your spares will be different to mine depending on what you have or obtain. This stuff is purely optional just to add some decor around the place, so use whatever you have and don't focus on trying to copy my exact bundle of spares here, because if I didn't have these spares I'd probably leave this step out completely because it's just not necessary. I picked out a few things from mine and I worked on gluing all the skulls together, and this is what I ended up with. With the skulls and spares put off to the side whilst that glue dried, I went back to the main project which was now ready to add the rubble. I used more tacky glue, picking random places, especially around areas where the building was showing particular state of ruin and collapse. I splattered the glue in place and then I just sprinkled the rubble mix on. It's just a mixture of sand and tiny pebbles filtered out of a bag of sharp sand. This is what the project looks like so far. It's really coming together, don't you think? Let me know in the comments if there's anything you would have done different so far, or any mistakes you think I've made, or any suggestions you have going forward in the future to improve all the steps that we've completed so far. I guess this is also a good time to say that if you're enjoying the video, please remember to subscribe. I'm a very new channel and I'm looking to grow, and I can't do it without you folks, so subscribe. Once that was dry, and yes, there are a lot of dry time periods, but that's just part of the package with this hobby. Don't be tempted to become impatient and skip drying times. I have done that in the past and always regretted it after messing up my project. But as I was saying, it was time for my favourite stage, base coating. I'm sure you've seen this on many videos, as it's a very common way of doing it because it just works. What you do is you get a whole lot of Mod Podge, mix some black paint in, and then paint over everything basically. That's it. You don't have to add the Mod Podge, you can just base coat this whole thing in black paint. However, the Mod Podge is a sealant. It's a glue that has varnish in it. Straight acrylic does not do that, and it won't seal your project. It will just cover it up with colour. If I was to paint this whole thing with no Mod Podge, it would look the same when done. But then say for example I was to add super glue on top of it, it would burn right into the foam. For example, eventually I will super glue the skulls to this. I can't do that if it burns the foam. The Mod Podge protects the foam and stops that. It will also strengthen the whole piece and add a feeling of sturdiness to it. On the flip side, you can just use Mod Podge, but it will dry clear and transparent and you won't be able to see any areas that you missed. For me, it's Mod Podge all the way. Just enough paint to turn the glue black. The glue will lighten it to grey at first, which would work as this is mostly a grey stone build anyway, but I will keep adding a drop or two of paint until it's completely black, as black will act as shadows in all the crevices when the dry brushing stage arrives. Another thing I've been asked before is, can you use PVA instead of Mod Podge because PVA is a lot cheaper? The short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, I could use PVA, but I don't want to, because it doesn't spread as smoothly. If you were to make two of these identically, and paint one in PVA and paint, and the other in Mod Podge and paint, you'd find the PVA one far more tedious. This is because Mod Podge, though it is a glue, and PVA not only contains varnish, but also some kind of flow aid. Nobody knows for sure because the exact recipe is their trade secret, but there is something in there that makes it spread with a brush a lot smoother and easier than standard PVA does. I will always recommend Mod Podge for this stage, and I personally will never swap it out for PVA in this stage. It's ironic really, because Mod Podge is a glue first and foremost, and yet I never ever use it as a glue. I only ever use the matte one as a sealant and the gloss one to make surfaces more shiny, such as the top of water. And in case you are wondering, this is generally good to go after a couple of hours, but because Mod Podge, like I say, contains varnish, I like to give it ample time for that to fully seal. I leave it overnight, but again, that's just my personal preferred habit. In the meantime, whilst leaving that overnight, I was able to focus on getting those spares painted. There's no point me taking you through in detail how I paint my spares, because it's unlikely that what I dug out of my spares box is going to be the same as yours. Just paint your spares whatever colour you see fit. For those who are still curious how I did my own, I'll show you a brief slideshow and explanation. First, I based it all in a bone spray primer, but I ran out 2/3 of the way through, so I primed them again all in white. Then I took a variety of bone and off-white colours and picked out random skulls. They stand out now, but in the end this will make very little difference. It's just to add a tiny hint of difference to them so that when they're finished, they will have a little variety in the tone without being the exact same shade. Then I painted all the metals in different tones, for the same reason as I did with the skulls. Then the cloth on these little banner things I found were basically coated in red, the wood in brown, and the leather in a brownish tan. All the skulls were then given a wash in Skeleton Horde contrast paint, and all the metals, wood and clothes were washed in contrast paint similar to their base colour. The banners were detailed in different tones of red with some orange for highlights. The wood and leather was dry brushed in a tan, and then the metals were all dry brushed in a silver. And finally, I used an orangey brown paint and a brown wash to make a rust effect on all the metals. My decor was now complete and placed out of the way until needed. Oh, and I did glue one fat skull to the main project, so once the Mod Podge had dried, I painted that in the exact same fashion as the other skulls that I've just shown you. Next, I work on some base coats. The pillars get a base coat in a neutral grey colour. It's well more than an overbrush and I use plenty of paint, but at the same time, I'm not bothered if I miss any spots, as this just allows some of that black to poke through in the deepest and darkest recesses, which in my opinion adds to the effect. I know that yes, some of the things I do seem pointless as it's mostly all covered up, but I like to do layering on the off chance that one day further down the line the surface is chipped or scratched off, and rather than it show raw materials underneath, it will show one of the other layers. Besides, adding all these little details just makes me happy. I once did an area of land, and deep beneath the grass, flock and mud was a buried skeleton. Nobody knew it was there was no way to see it, but I knew, and it always made me grin whenever I looked at that piece. So if you're wondering why I do so much potentially unnecessary layers, I just do, and I like it. The wooden coffee stirrers that we glued to the base of the pillars get a base coat in Lead Belcher Silver from Citadel Paint Range. It's one of my favourite metallic base coats because it is silver obviously, but it's a very dark grungy silver and I think it just works nice to base any metallic that you're planning to do. I will say now that these little wooden coffee stirrers are my nemesis of this project. I seem to have a nemesis on every single project I work on. If you watch my modular tiles video, which I'll link in the description, you will recall that the rocks were my nemesis in that video. This time, it's those bits of wood. I revisit them many times before I finally able to say I'm happy with them. From now on, I'll just refer to them as my nemesis. Well, seeing as though there are a lot of them, 8 on each pillar, I'll just call them my nemesis. All that tea leaf mixture that we made earlier, that gets a coat in a chocolatey brown colour. It goes on quite bright, but it dries a lot darker. I also did consider basing the bottom of the big crack, aka the summoning portal, in a blue layer, but decided against it almost as soon as I started, which is why you can see a touch of blue in there near the big skull from time to time. I didn't want the blue because I didn't want it to look like water or anything resembling water, because it's not. It's a gooey, slurpy, magical essence. So I chose a royal bright purple as the base, which I felt suited it a lot better. You'll see as this video progresses though, that I mainly cover that up and have to base it again later, because I realised this little hole in the ground becomes perfect for drying my brush when I'm doing dry brushing stuff, and I think I put about 15 different colours in there, but it works. The statue was base coated in a metallic copper paint by Darkstar. It's a lovely tone, it goes on thick, and I really like it. I should mention to you that if you want the features on your statue to be extra sharp, don't coat it in the Mod Podge like we did earlier. Just prime it with the proper primer instead. I used the Mod Podge because I didn't mind if any of the features get lost in the thickness of the glue and paint mix, but these miniatures really aren't meant for something as thick as that to cover over them, and the tiny little details will often get lost, but I didn't mind because I wanted it to look worn like everything else, and I think it does that. With all the base coating done, I wanted to add some variants of shade to the statue. Certain places where it might be a little more worn and grimy, or on the flip side a little more shiny. I did this with a couple of layers of lazy dry brushing in various other metal colours. By lazy dry brushing, I just mean I didn't try to dry brush everywhere, I didn't try to make it consistent, I just went over random spots and then I moved on. Now it was time for the pillars. In hindsight, I realised that the pillars were the things I spent the most time on in this project more than any other area. But they are quite the dominant feature in the build, so I felt like they needed special attention, and it pays off in the end in my opinion. I'm keeping in mind that though there is a lot of stone in this build, the pillars, the brick walls, the floors, I wanted to paint each of these three things in different ways using different tones, so that even though it all blends together in the end, it will still have slight differences to mix it up and stop it looking overall flat. I'm going to layer the colour on the pillars in stipple technique, scrubbing and heavy dry brushing. Though I will be layering many shades, I'm only actually using 3 colours for now. They're just cheap acrylic paints bought from the range for 99p a bottle. I'm using a dark grey, a white and a blue, and that's it. I'll mix up different shades with those 3 colours. I won't show you every single step in the video because that would take forever and this video is already getting quite long, but I'll play a little montage of some of it whilst explaining the steps to you. The first layer is almost completely white with just the slightest drop of grey in there. I stipple and scrub it on quite generously using a round dry brush, almost completely covering the base coat and leaving only a smidge of it showing through. I don't have a lot of paint on my brush, more than a dry brush, but I would say a little less than you would have if you were doing an overbrush. Next, I add a tiny bit of blue to that mix and a whole lot more white to brighten it up. Then I do the same as the previous step, just covering a smidge less of the area this time round. Then, I add more blue to the mix and go around for a third time in the same manner, covering a little less than last time. I start a fresh mix this time with dark grey and I mix just a drop of white and blue into there. It tones down the darkness of the grey a little but keeps the vibrancy. I stipple it only probably 2/3 of the areas, this adds a grungy look to it. Then I use a homemade black wash which I paint into the areas that I feel would be the darkest. I let that dry, then I go over the whole thing painting it all in the homemade black wash. And this is what we have at this point. It's important that whenever you put washes on anything you let the wash completely dry before moving on to the next step. This was perfect timing for me as I felt a presence nearby, a disturbance in the force, and when I turned around I saw one of the dogs staring at me with these googly eyes. So I decided it was time to give my doggos some attention and I took them for a walk, not only to stretch their legs but my legs too because I'd been sat at my desk for a long time. Once I got back home it was dry and I went over the whole thing in an off-white dry brush. This was just white paint with a touch of grey in it like the very first stipple colour we put on. And finally, once that was dry, I gave it a dry brush in pure white just to bring out some of the more dominant edges. This is what we have in the end and I'm very happy with the result. I was going a bit stir crazy from focusing on the pillars for so much, so even though I'm technically still on the pillars, I decided to switch to concentrating on my nemesis. I took some of that brown from earlier, the chocolate brown. I added a little bit of white just to lighten it a smidge, and then I added a bunch of orange just to turn it into a very orangey brown. And after cleaning up the Nemesises by going over with a fresh base coat of lead belcher, I then started to dab this orangey brown around the edges. My goal here was to try and start putting down the foundation of rust, because at this point in time, that was the direction I was going, for rusty steel or something like that. This does change in the future though, so if you're following along step by step and you want to do it exactly how I ended up doing it, don't bother with this step. I'm just showing you for the sake of transparency. Then I take 2 of my homemade washes. It's mainly going to be the brown wash that I use, but I put a couple of drops of black wash in just to make it a bit more darker and muddier looking. And then I get that wash and I just paint over all of the metal strips that I've just dabbed in the browny orange. It looks okay, it looks like rust and it's fine, there's no problem. I could leave it here and never come back to it, but these are my Nemesises for a reason, and further down the line I realise I don't like the look of rust and I want to change it completely, but we'll get to that part when we get there. I decide that I want to add some staining to the pillars themselves, so I take my homemade green wash and I add a little dab of brown to it, and I just start putting this here and there around the pillars wherever I think that water will build up or a lot of water will linger or flow across. Just a hint of moss without actually using moss, just stain algae and stuff like that, whatever you want to call it. I think it adds a real nice effect, and it also adds to the depth when you consider that we've done a black wash over this and some dry brushing, so this really adds that extra layer of visible appeal to the eye. By the way, if you want to see how I make my homemade black wash, then just let me know in the comments and I'll make a video about it. The reason I haven't is because it is very similar, maybe a little bit different to the vast majority of hundreds of videos out there that do show you how to make homemade washes. I really like my recipe that I have it. After all this time, I believe I have it nailed down perfectly to how I want it, with a good system and a good array of colours that I use to mix and match together. But if that is something you want to see, just let me know in the comments. I have absolutely no problem showing you. I'm going to be using this colour next. I don't even want to know how you're supposed to say that. Knickerbocker oxide. This one is by Citadel. There's also this one by another brand that is pretty much the same. If you don't have either of these, any blue-green acrylic would work fine as long as you water it down a bit. The reason I'm using this colour is because I want to age the statue, but because I've done it in a bronzy coppery look, I can't do a rust effect because bronze and copper doesn't really rust. Instead, an effect happens called patina. The most famous example of a patina weathering effect is the Statue of Liberty. It should actually look like this. It was never actually painted green, but the rain, etc. and stuff has weathered it and the patina effect has kicked in, as you can see. I want to do something similar to the statue, as right now it looks too shiny and clean and doesn't fit. The problem is I've never done this before, so I'm going in blind, which made me a little nervous as I did not want to ruin this project. The simplest way to achieve the effect that I could think of was by simply painting it on, working section by section, and then keeping a bit of tissue or kitchen towel nearby and just wiping it off in a downward motion every so often. This left it very subtle on the surface and kept it thick in the recesses. I'm the first to admit that I'm not very good at painting miniatures. There are pros out there who would put a lot more effort into this with a lot more layers, spend a lot more time, and it would look a lot more better. But I have my limits, I know them, and this was the best I could come up with, and considering it only took me about 15 minutes, I was happy with how it turned out. So back to my Nemesises. They stood out like sore thumbs to me, many sore thumbs that kept poking me in the eye to remind me that I just didn't like them. I took a basic acrylic gold metallic paint which I bought from Hobbycraft and I went over them all in that. Then I went to the store for groceries, totally unrelated I know, but wait for it. Whilst I was there, I saw these, which made me change my mind yet again. These are little gem thingamajiggamies that I found in the nail art section of Home Bargains, right next to the false nails and nail varnishes and stuff. They gave me the idea of adding bolts to the strips of what were supposed to be metal. I thought perhaps this would give me the change I needed to finally be happy with my Nemesis. Putting them on was a little fiddly. I squirted some tacky glue onto an old disposable paint palette and tried to dip the jewels in with tweezers, but they kept twanging from the grip of the tweezers and flying all over the place. Pretty sure some are still living in my beard to this day, nesting and building little settlements and having little gem babies on my chin. The easiest way to apply them, I found, was to spread them on the table face up, and then get a cocktail stick and dick. I'm not even going to cut that out, I can't be bothered. Dip the tip in the tacky glue. This made it sticky enough to touch the gem and pick it up that way. First though, I used the stick to dab some of the glue onto the nemesis where I planned to put the gems. Then I just, put them in place. It worked quite nicely actually. I didn't have to worry about colour as they would be getting painted over. This is what it looks like at this point, and it looks a lot better already, even if I do say so myself. Once the glue was completely dry, because I didn't feel like knocking any gems off and doing that again, I went back over it all in another gold base coat. Then I gave it a black wash to add shadow and grime and build up around the bolts, which made them stand out so much better. With the wash dry, it got a brief dry brush in the gold again just to bring some of the bling bling back to life. And then I gave it a dry brush in silver. Now I know solid gold doesn't rust or tarnish or fade like this ever. This kind of fading only happens with gold plated stuff, I get that, and perhaps it isn't completely realistic, but I wanted to do it anyway because I felt it was a nice touch, and at last I was happy with them. I had vanquished my nemesis and could officially move on. Painting the brick walls I knew was going to begin dramatically changing the look of this project. I was super excited for this part. I started with a mix of these colours that I am showing on the screen right now, and then I just picked out random bricks and painted them randomly in that random colour at random moments in random time. I used random amounts of pressure and random amounts of paint on my random paintbrush. It really added a variety to the wall as opposed to it looking factory built. You would barely notice this when it is done, especially not on camera, but when it's sitting in front of you, you will be able to see them different shades of rock and it would just look so good. It's definitely worth the extra effort. It then got a heavy dry brush in white everywhere. I wanted it to be overdone and too bold because I knew the washes would dull it down a lot and I didn't want to lose it completely in that process. The wash, as usual, was my homemade wash, mainly black with a drop or two of brown in it. And once the wash dried, it got a final and much more careful dry brush in white with a touch of cream paint added to that, just to bring back the sunlight catching the edges and the texture. This is the finished look, and I hope you can all tell on camera, those different colours of the bricks really make it pop nicely. The end is in sight, just a few more steps to go. If you've been here from the beginning, please consider giving the video a thumbs up to show your appreciation. From walls to floor next, like I said before, I wanted to paint each section of rocks in a different way. The floor is no exception. As you can see on the screen, I make a great amount of different shades of greys with reddish greys, brownish tones, bluish and greenish. Just a mix of all different tones for the floor using a shade of grey as the base ingredient for them all. I got all these paints from Hobbycraft and the range, they're very cheap, you don't need to buy the expensive stuff. Before I get to painting though, I take a sip of tea, which is super important and the most important step in this project. And look at the size of my cup, oh lordy. In a similar way as the brick walls, just pick out different tiles and paint them in one of the random colours. I actually did it a little bit differently, but that's just my process. It has the same result, and to be honest, it's probably a bit more hassle than it needs to be. But for those curious, I counted all the brick tiles. I then divided the tiles by the number of paint mixes I just made. Can't remember now off the top of my head, but let's for example say there was 100 tiles, 10 mixes, so you divide that, you get a total of 10. So then I picked one of the colour mixes and I painted 10 of the tiles sporadically across the project in that colour. I then picked another colour mix and did the same again, picking out 10 random tiles and doing them in that colour and so forth until all the tiles had a layer of paint on them. I also wouldn't say I completely drowned the tiles in paint. More than an overbrush for sure, but only just, as again it doesn't matter if some of the black pokes through. I also definitely tried to avoid getting the paint inside any of the cracks and deep recesses. They got a dry brush in off-white like the brick walls and you could technically leave it there. They look great, colourful and vibrant, and if I was making a better quality temple, I would leave it there because I really like it. However, this is an ancient, desolate, ruined place. So it gets two washes. It gets a black wash that covers everywhere, then it gets a brown wash that I only apply in the shadowy or rubble filled areas. Finally, one more dry brush to bring back the sun-kissed edges. And here we are, with all the stone pillars, walls and floors now complete. Love it. I gave the bottom of the summoning portal a fresh base coat. I'm sure you did see me using it as a dry brush palette through this project. It was so good that I'm definitely going to make another one specifically to use as a dry palette. If that's a project you would like to see, let me know in the comments. After I painted it, I dry brushed the stone around the edges with some of the purple as a quick OSL object source lighting effect to indicate a bit of the magic glow coming from the summoning portal. I also took the opportunity to touch up the tea leaves area with a bit of Rhinox hide brown. I thought this was a good time to add all the decoration that I painted up earlier, the skulls, the broken shields, the banners and stuff. I didn't show you footage of it because there's no point, I'm literally just gluing them on with super glue, but I'll show you this picture and you can see what it looks like when it's done. It worked fine, but remember, if you didn't seal this build in Mod Podge, the super glue would be melting the foam right now, so keep that important fact in mind so you don't destroy all your hard work. I had no particular plan in mind, I just put them wherever stood out to me in that moment and let my creativity lead the way. It seemed earlier like I had done too much in terms of decor, but you can see here that it really gives a new lease of life to the place and just looks incredible. I'm not inflating my own ego here, but I'm really proud of how this is turning out. Now at last it is time for the moss. I've been looking forward to this stage because I knew this was going to flip this build upside down and dramatically change the look. I want the moss because though we have speckles of colour here and there with the bronze, the skulls and the banners, they all have an undertone of grim old tattered look to it, which is great, but I think it's important in builds to not just have colours that blend together, but to have colours that conflict against each other too. The green of the moss is vibrant in contrast to everything else, and I feel that will really take this up a level to an epic proportion. So let's find out. For the moss, I have some flock that I've collected. It's just flock that spilled onto my table when I made my modular grass tiles. As you might know if you followed that video, I have shades of my flock organised into different tubs. This is all mixed together so couldn't go in those tubs, but rather than throw it out, I kept it for the moss where the fact that it's all mixed together doesn't matter, in fact it makes a nice blend. I put it in a tub with some PVA glue, give it a good mix, and then I just start putting it everywhere that I think it would grow, focusing as well on all those areas where I put down the green tea leaf mixture, and also up on the pillars and poking out of the brickwork here and there. It goes on very light, but the PVA will dry transparent and the shade will darken a little. Plus once it's all dry, I add my homemade green wash over the top of it to further the contrast. Now it's time to deal with the summoning portal, which is the final step, so we're almost there folks. I'll be honest, I can't afford the professional resin right now, so I just got this stuff. It cost me £2 from Poundland and it works just as well. Well, not just as well, it'll dry a little bit cloudy, so if you want it for water or something that's transparent, you're probably better off getting the professional stuff. But with this, I'm not having any transparency to the summoning portal, so this works fine. The key to this is to make sure you add some acetone. You can get it by getting nail varnish remover, which is what I do here. As you can see, I'm mixing it in. I mix it until it's thin, and then I add some mica powder, I add some glitter just to give it a really good shimmer, and then I pour it into the hole. I pour it carefully, I pour it evenly, I make sure it goes into all the gaps. Once it's all in there, I take some of this technical paint from Citadel, I splash some in there and I mix it with a stick. This is just to add an extra effect of that dark, corrupted, putrid magic. I then let it set completely overnight, even though it'll take nowhere near that much time. This is a really quick setting, and it's probably set within an hour at least. It'll start hardening within about 10 minutes, but it will set within about an hour. But I wanted to be sure, so I left it overnight. Then I took some Mod Podge and I just coated some Mod Podge over the top just to give it an extra sealant and an extra bit of gloss, because this is gloss Mod Podge, not the matte Mod Podge. That part's important. And that's it folks, we are done. The project is complete. If you want to protect your piece, I highly recommend the top seal. I use a matte sealant, but you can use whatever you normally use. The one I use is from Hobbycraft. It's water based so it doesn't damage or affect any of the build. Now let's see that kick-ass montage. there we go, one epic ruined temple with a cool and spooky summoning portal ruptured right out of the ground. How cool does that look? I can't wait to try this out in a Warhammer campaign. I hope you found this video helpful and enjoyed watching it. I know it was lengthy, but I didn't want to leave out any of the stages so that anybody who was following along and making this project too didn't reach a point where they became stuck because they didn't know what to do next. This is only my second ever project on YouTube. I'm very new to it, and it would be really appreciated if you could subscribe and tell your friends and all that, because I would really like to grow this channel into something special. For those of you who have subscribed, thank you so much for your support. It means more to me than you could ever know, and you have really helped me to feel something other than useless. These projects, whilst most definitely so much fun to make, the editing side of things is very difficult for me. I have a basic computer with very low processing power, and my whole system crashes multiple times throughout the process of editing as it struggles to handle it. It can be exasperating at times and makes me almost want to give up, corrupting files, forcing me to start all from the beginning. So the support from all of you who subscribe really makes it feel worth it for me, and I couldn't be more grateful. Thanks again. Anyway, for now, take care, see you in the next one, and toodaloo!